Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of r/ProRevenge. In today's episode, a friend set up my dad, and he was nearly beaten to death. My grandfather got revenge on everyone involved. EK chops down my tree, costs her £500,000, $700,000. Mugging the muggers. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe so you will never miss a video. So let's get started. A friend set up my dad, and he was nearly beaten to death. My grandfather got revenge on everyone involved. This isn't my story, but it comes from my dad and other family members who witnessed it. Background. This all went down in the late 1970s when my dad was 17. The area he grew up in was in the UK, and was a stereotypical working-class town. The part of town my family lived in was run down, full of poor families, and had its fair share of crime, but it was close-knit, and everyone knew everyone. This will be important later. Now my dad wasn't the most well-behaved kid, and he had hated being at school, but aside from a speeding ticket, he had never been in trouble with the police. He was, and still is, a really talented musician, and had a very active social life. For his 17th birthday, one of his friends had bought him a leather jacket with a very specific logo on it. We'll call this friend Dave for future reference. According to my dad, it was a rare and quite expensive motorcycle jacket. He was extremely happy that Dave had got it for him. Dave had bought himself the same jacket a while before, and it was a big surprise. My grandmother apparently joked that with the jackets on they looked like twins, and she wasn't far wrong. They had similar features, black hair, and were both well known for being kitted out in motorcycle gear. A few days after my dad's birthday, he was leaving work as a bartender in the town center at around 10 p.m. As he was getting close to where his bike was parked, a gang of 5 men approached him from behind. The last thing my dad remembers was being smacked over the head and passing out as he hit the floor. These men beat up my dad with bike chains and a crowbar, literally to within an inch of his life. Luckily, 2 bouncers from a nearby pub had heard the commotion and rushed to help. The men ran off, the bouncers called the cops, and my dad was taken to hospital. It turned out that Dave had quite a substantial gambling habit, and owed a large amount of money to people who he really didn't want to owe money to. They had threatened Dave and told him that they would be looking for him to teach him a lesson. So Dave decided to set up my dad to take the beating instead of himself, or at least lessen his chances of taking it. He had bought my dad the same jacket because these guys knew that was what he wore when he rode. He then arranged for a guy he knew to find out when my dad left work, and call up the loan sharks to let them know where Dave was. What a scumbag. The revenge. My grandfather and grandmother were obviously distraught about this whole thing. The first thought on my grandfather's mind was if my dad would survive. When that was answered, his second was how best to get revenge. Bit of background on my grandfather. He was a lifelong boxer and a career military man. He enlisted at the back end of WW2 at 17, stayed in the forces through Korea, and then served in Malaya and Burma as a scout and sniper during the mid to late 1950s. He only reluctantly retired when my dad was little and worked as an engineer after his discharge. This guy was a certified badass even into his 50s, and although he wasn't the best husband or father at times, he could never stand by and watch his family get hurt. The first move my grandfather made was to call up every ex-service buddy, bouncer, pub landlord, etc. that he knew, and even a few less than legit characters he knew from the pubs. In my town, word traveled fast, and my grandfather was well liked, and had a bit of a reputation, so it wasn't long before he had the names and addresses of the 5 men who had attacked my dad. Apparently these guys had been bragging about beating up a defenseless man from behind. These guys were career criminals with violent reputations, but my grandfather really didn't give a shit who or what they were. My grandfather then called up a few of the most dangerous, hardened guys he knew from the service. He explained to them what had happened, and they were all happy to help. One night, the group kicked in the doors of each thug and beat them to a pulp, all 5 of them. They knew that if they hit one, the others would hear about it and run, so they hit all 5 of them in one night. My grandfather knew that no one would call the police in the area they lived in. Talking to the cops was a big no-no in that area back then, so there was little chance of being caught. All 5 guys ended up bloodied with broken bones, shattered teeth, and the requirement to be fed from a tube by the end of the night. One of them had to be put into a medically induced coma. Of course, the police interviewed all of them in hospital when they sufficiently recovered, but none of them talked, both out of fear of my grandfather and fear they would be labeled as rats, and nothing came of it. But my grandfather wasn't done there. My grandfather used his connections in the clubs and bars to start spreading rumors about why they had been beaten up. Soon it had gotten round that these 5 guys had fucked up, and had beaten up the wrong person. Not only that, but they had bragged about it, and lied to whoever they worked for about it. Not only were they physically broken, but my grandfather ruined their credibility so that when they got out no one, criminal or otherwise, wanted to be associated with them. Once this was all done, my grandfather turned his attention to Dave. He had specifically left Dave for last, knowing that he would shit himself knowing that my grandfather knew what he had done. My grandfather, however, was much more subtle in dealing with Dave, as he thought that a simple beating would be too good for him. He waited and asked around, and it turned out that Dave was not only a compulsive gambler, but also had recently turned into a heavy drug addict as well. My grandfather found out who he was buying his drugs from when he would usually buy and where. He had a buddy of his follow Dave when he went to buy his stuff, follow him to where he was living, and let my grandfather know. My grandfather then called in an anonymous tip that there was a huge drug deal going on at the address, and he thought he heard gunshots. He got 2 of his buddies to do the same. The police investigated, searched the house, and caught Dave red-handed with boatloads of drugs in his home as well as counterfeit bills, and a ton of other illegal stuff. Dave was charged, denied bail, and ended up pleading guilty to all the charges laid against him. My dad could never remember his exact sentence, but it was definitely heavy, at least 15 years. To add to that, Dave owed a lot of money to a lot of people, and let's just say his time in prison was made much worse by this fact. My dad never spoke to him again, his parents disowned him, his girlfriend dumped him, he struggled to get a job with his record, and when he got out he had to move miles away as no one he knew wanted anything to do with him. My dad eventually recovered from his injuries, although you can still see various scars on his body from the beating he took. My grandfather never told anyone what he had done until my dad asked him about it when he got really ill in the early 1990s. Dave's life was ruined, and out of the 5 who attacked my dad, 3 ended up in prison later in life and 2 ended up dead due to crime. My grandfather passed away in the late 1990s, and although my dad and him had their issues, it could never be said he didn't look out for him when he needed it. EK chops down my tree, costs her £500,000, $700,000. It's been 2 years and I can finally post about this. This is juicy, so get ready. Background information: we live in an old and big manor that has been split into 3 attached houses. The houses are about 150 years old, and were built around 5 huge giant sequoias which were about 200 years old. In the UK, giant sequoias are very rare, and the 2 in our garden up the house price by about £60,000. We lived next to 2 really nice neighbors, 1 young couple and 1 old couple. The story: unfortunately, our old neighbors passed away, so their child and her family moved in. Let's call her Jo. Jo was instantly a pain in the ass. We had been sharing chickens with the previous neighbors, and Jo agreed to keep sharing them. However, on her nights she would constantly forget to put them away, so we would have to check them every night anyway. One night her little brats thought it would be funny to open our personal duck pen in the night, which leads to a mass slaughter. Later the chickens went the same way. About 2 years ago there was a storm and one of her sequoias somehow fell over and died. They were distraught, understandably, but from then on, the jealousy started. She would constantly complain about how lucky we were to have 2 sequoias in our garden, and how our sequoia was making too much shade in their garden. It wasn't, anyway. We just thought it was Jo being a pain. There were a few dry threats like they will chop it down or maybe the next storm will blow it down. Until we came back from a holiday to France to find a huge 6-meter stump and nothing else. I mean, how the fuck do you get rid of a 100 feet tree in like 2 weeks? 2 of our old British oak trees had been crushed as well. My mum and sisters were crying. My dad were red in the face, and we had no evidence Jo had done it. She claimed that there had been a storm and she had to get rid of it. We had a security camera at the front of the house, but you can get in the back if you go through a few fields. We then were given an £8,000 bill for damages to her property, and to have the tree chopped up and remove the wood alone would have been worth a small fortune. We had lost all hope, and 2 weeks had passed when my dad came running in from the garden. We had put up a wildlife camera a few months ago and had caught everything. We got a lawyer on the phone and started our revenge. We got a tree surgeon out who said it was an original specimen brought into the UK in 1860 along with the two that were in Elveston Castle Country Park. There were 218 around the UK, but only 60 now. He also told us to call out an engineer, because the roots might be in the foundation, so when they rot it could damage the house. Turns out we would need to redo the foundations. Then we took Joe to court and sued them for damage to property, trespassing and lots of other smaller claims. The tree would cost $250,000 to have another sequoia that was 200 years put in and looked after. It's basically impossible, plus the damage to the foundation which was $200,000 and the two oaks which were another $25,000. So with the smaller claims it went to about £500,000, $700,000. They had to move out. And we have now paid off the mortgage, done a lovely loft and kitchen conversion, and have basically done up the house and garden as well as plant a 60-year-old sequoia tree in the back garden. We also had our kitchen counter and table made from the old sequoia. We now have a new lovely family living next to us who we share chickens, ducks and pygmy goats with. They're very nice, and I make a fortune babysitting their kids. Sorry for the essay. Mugging the muggers. First time posting, sorry if I get it wrong. This is not my story, but a story my friend told me. Sorry, this is a long one, but there's a lot to this story. First, a little bit of context. My friend, let's call him D, worked for many years as a pizza chain delivery driver. He didn't need to, he has his own business, but he did it for pocket money, and to appease his in-laws who considered him a deadbeat if he didn't have a time clock punching job. My friend is also a firm believer in the Second Amendment, and is known for legally carrying firearms wherever he goes, even to this day. D equals my friend, M equals mugger, MIL equals mother-in-law. Believe it or not, she is ex-law enforcement and has a place in this story. At the time of this series of incidents, D worked at a store that was in our version of inner city. Not many tips, lots of bad directions, no shows, and customers trying to do anything to get a free meal. This is where our story starts. So D was working the evening rush shifts when they get a call in order at an apartment complex that's particularly known for stiffing the drivers. When the pizza was ready for delivery, it was his turn to make the run. He knew he would be stiffed, but it was really close to the store. So he took the pizza and drove to the complex to make the delivery. Now, the drivers are not supposed to be armed, but there had been a rash of muggings and burglaries in the area, and the drivers that had guns had started keeping them in their vehicles for safety. So he gets to the complex, leaves his gun on the dashboard, locks his truck, and proceeds up the stairs to the pizza's destination. As he goes up the stairs, he notices a youngish Hispanic guy outside the apartment opposite his, smoking a cigarette. He says hi as he walks up to the door of his order, then turns and rings the doorbell. Nothing. He knocks on the door. Still nothing. He knocks again, calling out pizza delivery. No response. He double-checks the tag, and it's the correct address, but nobody's home. Great, another no-show. He shrugs, turns around and starts to head back down the stairs. What's the matter? They know there? The SUX, man. D, yeah, it happens. Well, you have a good one. He starts walking down the stairs, and heads toward his truck. He gets down almost to the bottom of the stairs, when hey man, what's gonna happen to that pizza? D, it'll get eaten at the store, or someone will take it home. He continues walking, and he faintly hears M coming down the stairs. How much is it, man? Maybe I could pay it for Jew. By this time, D is at his truck, and has it unlocked. He has a pretty good idea of what is happening, but he's playing ignorant. He turns back to face M. If you want to buy it, I'll sell it to you. I ain't got the much with me. D, I understand, dude. Have a good one. He gets in his truck, puts the pizza on the seat, and grabs the gun to move it to the seat beside him. His window is rolled partially down to let in fresh air. He's not surprised 30 seconds later when there was a tapping on his open window. Sure enough, M is at his truck, tapping on his rolled down window with a big S knife and a big shit-eating grin on his face. With a knife in his hand, I think you should just let me have that pizza. And I'll take your wallet too, man. D already had his gun in his hand, so he pulls it around and points it at M. I don't think so, man. Think you can manage to stab me before I pull the trigger? Back away from my window, dude. M goes pale and his jaw drops. He puts his hands up. I was just effkin' joking, man. Take it easy. D gets back out of his truck, still pointing the gun at M. M looks terrified. M, what you gonna do, man? D, I'm going to mug the mugger, big smile. Toss the knife into the back of my truck, dude. Right now. Come on. M, this is my best knife, man. D, and now, it's mine. I'll take your shoes, and your belt too. Hurry it up. Toss them in the back of the truck too. M grumbles as he tosses the knife into the back of D's truck, then pulls off his belt, and sits down on the bottom step to take off his shoes. The whole time he's cussing in Spanish under his breath. He then tosses belt and shoes into the back of D's truck. Now what? D, back up the stairs. Dude D's backs up to the door of his truck. You have a nice night, now. He gets into his truck and drives away. When he gets home, he takes the knife out of his truck. It really is a nice knife, so he adds it to his knife collection. The belt and shoes were decent too. The shoes were actually steel-toed work boots. Not D's size, so he gives them away to someone he thinks could use them. About a week and a half later, D is once again working the evening rush shift. An order comes in from the same complex. D knows that complex well, and realizes this order goes to the same parking lot, just 2 buildings down from where the attempted mugging happened, so just to be safe, he tells the manager he will take it when it comes out. D's pretty sure M has learned his lesson, but he doesn't want to take chances with another driver. So when the pizza comes out, he packs it up and drives out to the complex. Tonight, the parking lot is pretty full, and he can't pull up in front of the building. So he parks his truck and grabs his gun and puts it in his hand. Then he grabs the insulated bag the pizza is in and puts it over the gun in his hand. The bag covers the gun perfectly, so no one will know he has the gun unless he puts the bag down. He walks to the apartment, ground floor this time, and rings the bell, then knocks on the door a couple of times. No one's there. He shakes his head and turns around to head back to his truck. There stands M, this time with a big baseball bat in his hands. Guess he didn't learn his lesson after all. M, you ain't at your truck this time, man, what you gonna do now? Big shit eating grin. D yanks the bag off and points his gun at M. That's okay, I brought it with me this time. Now, why don't you turn around slowly, put your hands up, and walk calmly back to my truck? You remember what it looks like, right? M, oh man. M puts his hands up, turns around, and walks to D's truck. D, you know the drill, dude. Toss it in the back. M, man, I just got this. D, and now, you're giving it to me. Toss it in. M tosses the bat into the back of the truck. D, now, where's your wallet, dude? If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.